Stories are not new to any of us. We have been surrounded by stories our whole lives. Right from being told Goldilocks and the Three Bears and Little Red Riding Hood, to maybe coming home now from school and telling your parents about something that happened during the day, speaking to your friends at break time, watching a movie, reading a novel, sitting around a campfire. Stories are everywhere, and they've been around for thousands of years, verbally. But the story, as in the novel, has actually not been around for very long. And so you may be wondering, where does the novel originate? Well, in the early 1800s, most people who could read were wealthy, and so therefore a lot of people could not read. And those wealthy people, the aristocracy, were mainly reading journals and finance and things like that. There was no need for stories. But then by the 1850s, mid-1800s, a lot more of the middle class was learning to read. Now, they weren't interested in reading journals and finance. They wanted something that was easy to understand and something that they enjoyed. And so there was that need for a fictional novel, right? And so a lot of writers actually started becoming prevalent at that time, writing novels. Now, the short stories did exist in the early 1800s. They weren't that popular, but they really started getting popular once the print came about. Once stories could be printed in magazines and newspapers and things like that, they really exploded. And, we still get hundreds and thousands of short stories written every year. Some short stories remain very popular despite being written decades ago. The Necklace, Gift of the Magi, Charles, Lamb to the Slaughter. There are a lot of them. But if I had to say to you, name 5 short stories, you might not be able to do that, simply because you don't actually know what constitutes a short story. So I hope by the end of this video, any questions that you may have about short stories will be answered, and that you'll be able to go forward with all the concepts and definitions that you need. So let's get started. The first thing I'm going to be showing you is the contents, and that is exactly what is this video about. Now, there are 8 sections that we're going to be talking about. The first one is how short is short. Then we're going to be talking about what actually makes a short story a short story. What are its characteristics? We're going to be talking about types of narration, types of characters, which leads us into characterization. How does the writer create these characters and their personalities? We're going to be talking about conflict, which is basically something that belongs to almost every single story ever. We're going to be talking about what constitutes the plot, how is it structured, and finally we're going to be talking about some terminology that is very common. Now, these characteristics, as it were, do overlap into other forms of literature, but let's say that all these kind of characteristics belong to the short story. So let's have a look. First of all, how short is short? Well, you can usually read a short story within one sitting. Now, I know some people get so excited that when they get a new book in a series, they just sit there solid 8 hours, read the book cover to cover. But that's not the norm. So we're going to say anywhere between 30 minutes to 2 hours is essentially one sitting. And there's a little bit of a debate between how many words make up a short story. But the general consensus is that if it's between 1,000 and 15,000 words, some say 20,000, then it is considered a short story. Now, the characteristics of a short story. First of all, it's fiction. In other words, it's not real. It's not an autobiography. It's not factual. Okay? It's written in prose. What is prose? Prose is like everyday language. So, for example, me speaking right now is prose. What is not prose? Poetry. If it's written in a kind of meter, in other words, iambic pentameter, etc. It has a self-contained incident or a series of linking incidences. In other words, there's one main storyline. You don't have subcategories of this story amongst these characters, while simultaneously this story is happening between those characters. There's usually a few characters and one main story happening. Which brings me to only a few characters. Why is that? Because the short story writer doesn't have many words actually to work with. He's got a very limited space, and he obviously wants to develop some characters. I mean, you want to have a character that you know a bit about. So in order to capitalize on that, he has to have only a few characters. One main source of conflict. As I say, conflict is almost paramount to any story, but there's usually only one main issue. And lastly, the plot structure. So we're going to be discussing this later, but a short story generally has a certain kind of structure in terms of this happens, then this, then that. But that's not set in stone. It can be different. Remember, it can be different. But we're going to talk about the basic plot structure. Okay, narration. Types of narration. First of all, we get first person narration. First person narration is like you telling a story. Like you are going to tell me what happened on the weekend. So you say, I did this, I did that. So look for the pronoun I, then you know first person. Okay. Now there's an advantage and a disadvantage of using first person. The advantage is, because you're telling it from your own experience, I'm able to get an idea of exactly what you experienced. You know, if I hear through somebody else what you did on the weekend, he's not going to know everything because it's not you. So because you're telling me, I'm able to get a better idea of what happened. However, the disadvantage is that I only see things from your perspective, so there's that subjectivity. You know, you might say the storm was bad, you know, it was really bad, or that person spoke to me really badly, but maybe it wasn't that bad. You know, another person might think the storm wasn't that bad, I've seen much worse. You know, you've never experienced thunderstorms, so any thunderstorm to you is bad. Okay, so there's that subjectivity and also that bias. You know, I might say so-and-so is a terrible person, but that's only because I think that. Nobody else thinks it, or other people don't think it. Okay. Then we get third person and third person omniscient. Now it's important to differentiate between the two. Both of them will talk about he and she. Okay? In other words, it's not you. You're talking about somebody else. But if it's only about one character, let's say call him Jack, and he's going to climb the beanstalk. I only know what Jack's thinking, and I only know what Jack is doing. I don't know what his mother's doing while he's climbing the beanstalk. But if I know what every character at any given time is thinking and feeling and doing, then that is third person omniscient. Omniscient means all-knowing. It's like I'm God, okay? Like I can look down and not only can I see what everybody's doing, but I know what everybody's thinking and feeling, okay? So that's third person omniscient, all-knowing. Let's look at the type of characters. Protagonist versus antagonist. Okay, a protagonist, pro means before him. So the protagonist is the main character. Okay, it's usually the most important character, and he or she changes and grows. In other words, the person that he or she is at the start of the story is not the same person that he or she is at the end of the story, because the situation or the things that happen to that person throughout the story, because of the conflict, changes that person. They will never be the same again. Okay. Whereas the antagonist, which by the way doesn't have to be a person, it can be a thing. All right. But let's say it's a person. They oppose the protagonist. So you think of your typical baddie, you know, the bad guy. And, you know, I'm not going to talk about certain movies too much because I don't know what you guys have watched, or books, I don't know what you guys have read and stuff like that. So use the knowledge that you have of stories that you know to try and think about all these terms and try and apply them to those stories. Okay. So the antagonist, if you antagonize somebody, you irritate them, you go against them, you stop them from achieving their goal. Okay, so the start of the story will be like the protagonist is all living happy days, whatever. Then the antagonist comes in and affects that person's life and tries to either mess up their life, stop them achieving a goal, etc. Okay, the antagonist does not change. You know, we don't really care about the antagonist. You know, we only care about the protagonist because that's the person that we're often made to love or like. All right. So the antagonist, who cares? Like, what happens, okay? And they're not going to change. Like if they're evil, you're not going to have like the Joker in Batman start off evil and then by the end of it decide that he's done all this wrong and he actually can please forgive me kind of thing, He starts off evil, he ends evil. And like I said, the antagonist doesn't have to be a person. It can be nature, it can be society. Let's take the movie Poseidon. It's about this giant cruise liner who is hit by this giant tidal wave or rogue wave and capsizes the ship. Now, the antagonist in that film is actually that wave, right? It's not actually a person. And sure, there's like dynamics within the ship and all that, but essentially the antagonist is the wave. It screws up the people's lives. All right, a little bit more about characters. We have round characters versus flat characters. A round character means that that character develops. We know a lot about that character. We know what their strengths and weaknesses are. We know what they feel. We know maybe what their desires are, what their goals are, etc. Okay? A flat character, on the other hand, is one-dimensional. In other words, we don't learn much about them. Like we learn maybe X, Y, Z, and that's that. Okay, there's no development. And I say stereotypical. I mean, I've got those pictures there, Shrek on the side, which I'm sure many of you have seen. Shrek obviously being the protagonist, and Lord Farquaad being the antagonist. Now, Lord Farquaad doesn't really change at all. It's like he's kind of just evil, and that's that. We don't know much about him, and we don't care. We don't need to know anything about him. But let's take Shrek, for example. Shrek starts off very cold, hates people, doesn't want anybody in his lives, happy to be alone, whatever. And by the end of the story, he's certainly changed, and he's become softer in a sense, and he allows people into his life and things like that. Okay. Then we have static versus dynamic, which links in with round and flat, really. So the static character is the antagonist, doesn't change, okay? And a dynamic character, which is often the protagonist, changes, as we spoke about, as a result of the story's events. So we get protagonist, usually a round character, and usually dynamic. Not always, but most of the time. And then we get the antagonist, who's also usually a flat character and static. Okay. Now, characterization. How does the writer make the reader know exactly what the character is all about, what type of person that character is? There's a saying with storytelling that they say, show, don't tell. A good writer will show you, a bad writer will tell you. So don't tell me that he is cruel, ideally. Rather show me that he's cruel. So instead of me as a writer saying, John is cruel, I will give you a scenario where John refuses to help somebody and treats somebody badly and speaks to them badly. I don't ever say that he's cruel, but me as the reader will know, yes, that's cruel, based on what I've read, okay, and what the character does. So characterization, is all about how the author develops the characters. Okay, how is this done? Through what the character says or does, so the dialogue. What others say of and to the character. Look at how the other characters speak about him or her. That also gives you an indication of what type of character he is. And then the author's word choice. What type of adjectives, for example, does the author use when talking about that character? Okay. There are two types of characterization. And I see there are characterization with the S and characterization with the Z. Well, that's American and this is the British. We usually go with the British, so apologies for that. It's not incorrectly spelled, but it's just different variations. Okay, so direct characterization. In other words, like I said, usually kind of frowned upon, however, sometimes necessary so that there's no ambiguity. Direct characterization is like the writer's going to say, he is kind. Boom, done. Okay. Indirect characterization is when you don't make it so obvious, the reader has to figure it out. So you show a character's personality through his or her actions, thoughts, feelings, appearance, words, etc. Okay, we make the assumption, or we come to the conclusion of what type of person he or she is based on those things. It's not actually explicitly spelt out for us. Conflict. Conflict is a struggle between two opposing forces. Now, as I spoke about earlier about the wave and the ship, that's obviously an external conflict. It's something outside of the main character, okay? But conflict can be internal as well. You know, let's take this picture on the right here between Buzz Lightyear and Woody in Toy Story 1 specifically, okay, which I'm sure many of you have seen. Buzz Lightyear's conflict is not the toys. It's within himself, because he believes that he is not a toy. And the other toys are obviously toys, and they're self-aware and they know they're toys, and they're trying to convince him that he is in fact a toy. Okay, so that's internal conflict. But then let's take The Kingsman, where we have Samuel L. Jackson here. He is the antagonist, and he is a form of external conflict. There is something outside of the main character that is causing a problem. And in this case, it's him, trying to mind control everybody. Okay. So internal takes place in the character's own mind, man versus himself. External can be man versus man, in other words, between two humans. Man versus nature. Let's think about Titanic hitting an iceberg. The iceberg is nature. Man versus technology, man versus society, man versus supernatural. I mean, we can talk about a clown, or we can talk about dinosaurs, or the Joker, or whatever the case. Okay, the Joker is man, actually, sorry. But supernatural, like if we go into like horror movies, for example. Okay. Plot. What is the plot? The plot is a series of related events that make a story. Now, this is important, okay? This here is the general structure of a plot. So we start here, we have the exposition, also known as introduction. So we are introduced as a reader to the world that we are being addressed. So in other words, it's taking place during the 1980s, or it's taking place in space, or whatever the case is, and these are the main characters. Then at this point here, between the exposition and the rising action, there is conflict. Something happens to change the timeline. Something happens to these people, whether it's internal or external. Okay. This is what we call the rising action. In other words, during this point, the protagonist, or the main character, tries to solve the problem. Let's take a romance, for example, or a rom-com. The guy falls in love with a girl. You know, he starts off, life is just great. Then he meets this girl. Now he needs to try and win her over. And he tries to do a couple of things. But he fails. You know, attempt number 1, buying her flowers or whatever, doesn't work. Okay. If we talk about, you know, the Avengers or whatever the case is, they try and solve the problem. They try and destroy the antagonist, doesn't work. Okay. Now, us as the reader, we are like wondering now, ooh, what's going to happen? You know, are they going to win? Are they going to die, or what? Okay. So the conflict is driving this rising action until we reach the climax. Now the climax of the story is like the most amount of tension. This is like your typical big boss fight. You know, this is when the protagonist and the antagonist meet face to face, and now it's going to be like, okay, who's going to win, who's going to lose? Then we get the falling action, or the French word denouement. Okay, denouement. Where like, okay, the climax is over, this is the result, this is what is the story world is now. Okay, and then we get the resolution, or the conclusion, at the end of the story. What happened to the main characters? You know, how have their lives been changed? What does the future hold? Is it happily ever after, or what? Okay, let's look at them in a little bit more detail, and it's important that you understand these concepts, because they're going to be with you all the way till matric. Okay, the exposition. This is the section that introduces the characters and the setting, and then the conflict. It's important to do that, and it happens pretty quickly most of the time. Sometimes in a short story, the reader is left wondering, this is character we've been hearing about, we don't even know what his name is, okay? That's just adding a little bit of suspense to make you want to read more. But usually it's pretty quick. It doesn't take long for the writer to tell us this is the main character and this is where we are, this is the time period that we set in, etc. Beginning part of the story, and an event of some kind, like I spoke about, ends this exposition and starts the plot. When I spoke about that change in the curve, as it were, that angle there, that point of conflict, that's something that starts the story. We call that generating circumstance. Nobody wants to read a story about where a guy goes to work, does what he's supposed to do, everything's just peachy, comes home, makes supper and goes to sleep. That's boring. Nothing happens. What makes a story interesting is that something happens to the protagonist that changes how things normally would go. The guy goes to work and suddenly the building is held up by a bunch of hijackers. So that's the kind of thing that we need, that generating circumstance. The setting, I spoke about, where is it set, time period, what's the weather like, etc. The rising action, now we get these complications which introduce the main conflict. Let's take that movie The Day After Tomorrow, for example. Everybody's kind of going about their day, and we know it's getting damn cold or whatever, but the next minute all hell breaks loose, and we're trapped inside this library and it's flooded outside and freezing and snowing and whatever. We'll die if we step foot outside. Okay, so then it's okay, what are we going to do? Let's burn the books, make a fire. Then what? We can't stay here forever. Blah blah blah. The father finds out that his son's trapped in the library. He has to go and do something. So there's various complications that happen that drive the plot. This rising action occurs when the main characters take action to try and fix their problem, but they are met with further problems. And those are just some examples: fear, hostility, threatening situation, whatever cases. Okay. Climax, as I said, it's the turning point, it's the high point of interest, suspense. It's usually the most exciting, intense, or thrilling. It's often a pivotal moment because it's at this point where either the conflict's going to be resolved and it's going to end in a good situation, or it's going to end in a bad situation. The person was ill, and the climax is they're being rushed to hospital and they don't make it, and that's that. Okay, that'd be a very depressing story. But there's also a story, The Life of David Gale, as well, where this guy's in jail and this woman's got 3 days or whatever to try and convince or prove that he's innocent, and she's rushing against the clock, and the end of it, he's executed. She didn't make it in time, so it doesn't have to be positive. Falling action, all the events following the climax or the turning point, and these events are a result of the action taken. The climax, and then of course we get the denouement, or the resolution. Now those pictures there on the top right are from Titanic, another movie, classic, which I'm sure a lot of people have seen. This scene over here is just after the ship is sunk, and the whole story really goes with Rose and Jack and their love affair. So obviously things are going smoothly, and then when the ship hits the iceberg, that sets in motion kind of conflict, and then of course it's okay, the ship is sinking, there's a time limit, but there are other complications because her fiance wants him dead, etc., blah blah blah, and he's handcuffed and the ship is sinking and now he can't get out, and etc. Okay, so there are a lot of things, but some might say that the climax is when the ship is going down, finally sinking. It really is at this point over here where they're still both alive, and you start questioning, well, they're still together in a sense, but are they both going to survive? And once we find out that Jack dies and she has to let him go, that's kind of the resolution, or the falling action, sorry. The falling action is okay, he didn't make it. She's certainly not the same person that she was at the start of the story, because at the start of the story she was going to get married to another guy. Now she's lost both guys, okay? And then the resolution is like, okay, well, how is this all going to go about? Well, we find out that eventually she met some other guy and she lived the rest of her life until she was like 101 or whatever the case is. Okay, so the resolution in the denouement doesn't have to be long. It can be sometimes drawn out, or it can be very sudden. Sometimes we don't even know, like there isn't one. Like the story just ends on like a cliffhanger and we're wondering like, well, what happened? And that's often used in like a series when they want you to read the next book or watch the next episode. Lastly, common terminology. Okay, the theme, the central message. So the theme of a short story is like, what is the main message? Is it about love conquers all? Is it about good always trumps evil? Is it about don't trust anybody? So those are all kind of themes. A flashback, we all know what a flashback is, where we go back to a previous time. So somewhere in the story we might go back like 10 years or whatever to see a little bit about what happened there. Foreshadowing. Foreshadowing is very important. We use hints and clues as a writer or writers to suggest what's going to happen later in the plot. Now the thing about foreshadowing is that it's often discovered only after we've finished the story. So you might read the story and then you'll be like, read it again, and then you'll be like, okay, I can see why the writer said that, he's hinting at something. Or sometimes it's a little bit more obvious, like we're told something, he puts it in his pocket and we're like, why would the writer tell us that? He's telling us that for a reason. And then later on in the story, that book that he put in his pocket becomes very important, for example. Symbols. Symbols are like objects or people or events in a sense that stand for something else. So obviously, like we can take a heart and we say, okay, literally it's an organ in the body, but it also stands for something more than just pumping blood. It stands for love. The dove, yes, it's a bird, but it stands for peace. An eagle can stand for freedom, for example. Winter often stands for death. Sunrise can stand for a new beginning, like a new start. A full moon often signifies danger, weirdness. You think of werewolves, things like Dracula, things like that. Okay. The mood of a short story, the atmosphere which is created. How do you feel while reading this story? Is it eerie? Is it unsettling? Does it make you feel anxious? Okay, that's the kind of mood that we're talking about here. All right, irony. 3 main types of irony. The first one is verbal irony. I say something, but I mean the opposite. Okay. So say for example, you say, wow, that building looks pretty. And I say, yes, it's an absolute stunner. But in actual fact, it's like run down, the windows are broken. So like I say something but I mean the opposite. Often confused with sarcasm, because the difference is sarcasm is insulting. Sarcasm is when you hurt somebody's feelings. Okay. Verbal irony. Verbal, I say the opposite of what I mean. The second one is situational irony. Something happens that is not what we expect. Let's say for example, the banker doesn't know how to manage his money, or the maths teacher doesn't know how to solve that simple sum. So that's kind of situational irony. And then thirdly is dramatic irony, where we as the reader or the viewer know something that the characters don't. So say for example, there's a character hiding under the bed with a gun. We know he's there. And then the main character walks into the room and we're like, the guy's under the bed. She doesn't know that he's under the bed. We know that he's under the bed. So that's dramatic irony. Suspense and imagery. On our last slide now, suspense is uncertainty or anxiety, okay, that the reader feels about what is going to happen next. Obviously quite an important asset in a lot of storytelling, because it makes the reader want to know more and read further. And lastly, imagery. Language that appeals to the senses. As a writer, you need to be able to create a picture in the reader's mind that is the same, or at least as similar as possible to the one in your mind. And I always say that to storytelling, to writers who want to tell a story. Try, you've got in your mind this image, this idea of a story and who the characters are and the setting and all that. You need to be able to make your reader have the same idea in their heads, in their minds, okay? Or at least as similar as possible. And how do you do that? You focus on the senses, the touch, the taste, the sight, the sound, and the smell. So guys, that's the end of the video. I hope that's really helped you and prepared you for reading any short story that comes your way. And to all the short stories that are going to come your way, enjoy them. Go in knowing that you have this knowledge and try and apply it to all the stories that you read.